Hi, everybody. We're about to dive into chapter one content, and we're going to dive into it really quick. First, I wanted to give you a reminder. If you're watching this video, we are probably going to be starting week two, which is August 29th through September 2nd. Just wanted to give you a reminder that your chapter one achieve content, or sorry, chapter one achieve assignments are going to be due Friday at 11:20 or 11:59. So make sure you are working on those and getting those done before the deadline. In addition, the Achieve Intro Survey and the Achieve Orientation assignment are also going to be due Friday. Checking my gradebook, I noticed that a lot of you had already done it, but there was an issue with the linking in the course. So I reopened it of both of those assignments for anyone who was unable to access it because of that linking error. So those are both open and due. We also have the first the first official post, discussion board post that's going to be due. Remember, your initial post is due on Wednesday, and then you have to respond to a classmate on Friday. So I will not be reopening these discussion boards, right? These are your participation grades. So you have to do them to get your participation points alongside with watching these lectures. So make sure you're looking at our course calendar, you're seeing what exactly is due this week. And for this week, you're watching the chapter content, you're watching parts of the journal article content, you are doing your Achieve assignments, and you're posting to the discussion board. So we are going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my screen in just a second. And this chapter is going to be in two parts. And so I'll tell you when we're cutting off and on what part we're cutting off in this lecture, so you know where to pick up if you're following along on the handouts. So let me share my screen. I'm going to make this large. Okay, so we are starting again with chapter one. And so this chapter is Thinking Critically with Psychological Science. In this, we're going to be going over some of the history of psychological science and psychology, some of the different branches in the field, as well as going through the scientific method and how we as psychological researchers or psychologists apply those steps to our research. Right, so starting off, psychology is a science. We approach our studies with the scientific method, scientific inquiry. We follow very stringent sort of requirements for the quality of our research, right? So we employ an empirical approach. We explore and attempt to explore and understand without misleading or being misled. So using those critical thinking skills is really important in our psychological research. And doing this research requires a scientific attitude, which means we're curious, we're skeptical, and we have humility. We understand that our research can be disproven or unsupported at any time. So let's talk about critical thinking in psychology and in science in general. Critical thinking is a skill that has to be learned, right? And some components of that are examining our assumptions. So everyone has assumptions, and being able to identify what those are before going into your own research or consuming information is really important. Understanding and appraising the source that the information is coming from, right? Is this from a Facebook feed image? Is this from some random tweet? Or is this from a journal article or an accredited news source, right? Understanding where our information is coming from. Discerning our hidden biases, right? What do we have biases toward? Do we have bias toward a specific news outlet? Do we have a bias toward the kind of person our information is coming from? Understanding what those biases are will help us understand if we're thinking critically about the information we're consuming. Evaluating the evidence. Was it done in a way that is generalizable, right? Was it a study with just 5 people, or was it a study with 1,500? It makes a difference. And then we're assessing the conclusions, and we're always being open to new information as it presents itself. So let's talk a little bit about the history of psychology. Our first laboratory was run by Wilhelm Wundt, a German psychologist, and he sought to measure the atoms of the mind. Then we have the first psychological schools of thought, so the foundations for the different branches that we're going to be talking about later. The first person was Titchener. He's a his school of thought was structuralism, and it was a technique of introspection, understanding how our internal thoughts sort of structured themselves. We also have William James, who was influenced by Darwin and Darwinism and natural selection. His school of thought was functionalism and adaptive thinking, and he wrote Principles of Psychology in 1890. So psychology kind of got its start in the late 1800s. Then we have the first women of psychology, which is Whitney Calkins, was a pioneering memory researcher. She was also the first female APA president, which is American Psychological Association, and Floy Washburn, who was the first female PhD student. She worked in synthesized animal behavior, and she was an author on The Animal Mind, which was published in 1908. So it's really important to understand how psychological science either did or did not, and currently does or does not embrace diversity and inclusion, because it's important to know, who is thinking up these psychological foundations and schools of thought, who is in the room conducting the experiments or the studies, and who is participating in those experiments and studies. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the downfalls of psychological science and where it has not been diverse and inclusive, and if the work we've done could be generalizable to populations that aren't, say, white college educated men. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So let's talk about some of the major forces and branches of psychology from the 20s to the 60s. Our first one is behaviorism. So this almost solely focuses on external behaviors and what impacts those behaviors. So introspection in psychology, now viewed as a scientific study when behaviorism started to sort of pop on the map. Behavior scientifically defined, conditioned, observed, and measured. So we'll see some of the dog studies, and we'll see also the Little Albert study, which was done by Watson and Rayner. And it was the experiment to see if fear could be learned. So I'm actually going to show you a brief video. I'm going to pull this up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to pull up the video. So Little Albert was a study of about a child, a toddler. I think he was around 1 or 2. And the idea that he could have a learned fear. And they were trying to get him to fear a white rat. And so we're going to watch this video very quickly.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work.
So we are not going to be talking about classical conditioning in this chapter, but we will be talking about it in future chapters. And so just briefly, classical conditioning is essentially just teaching someone or an animal to react in a certain way to a particular stimulus. So in this example with little Albert, they were trying to teach him to fear an animal through a conditioning or a learned response, which you're going to see here in just a little bit.
The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
So during this part of the study, they're just exposing him and getting like a baseline for how little Albert interacts with these animals. So dogs, rats. I think he also is exposed to a bunny and maybe another animal. Oh, the monkey. Yeah, there's the bunny. So as you can see right now, he has really no interaction or no fear response to these animals. He's just inquisitively looking at them.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So now we're seeing in the video briefly said what this was, and this is generalization. So little Albert, while his conditioning was with the rat and the loud noise that followed the rat, he associated this fear response with anything that was like little and fluffy, or I mean big and fluffy, right? The dog, that fluffy, just like object, was pretty big. So anything that was white, fluffy, an animal, he learned through that conditioning to fear it. And this actually, this study particularly, but there's many studies that we're going to talk about throughout the course, also kind of leads to a discussion of ethics in psychological science, especially the almost pre-90s studies that were being conducted and how ethical they were. And is a reason why a lot of them cannot be replicated, because it would be unethical to put a toddler through a learned fear response. And that study, that little Albert, he wasn't very well documented after the study, but he was followed up on a couple of times. And that learned fear response really impacted him for the rest of his life, particularly with animals, right? He had learned to fear furry little creatures. Let me reshare my PowerPoint. Make this large again. So that's that behaviorism, right? The just solely focusing on interactions with stimuli, behaviors, how they're observed, how they're learned, and how they're measured. Then we move on to a branch of psychology that you might be more familiar with, which is Freudian psychology or psychoanalytic psychology, emphasized ways that the unconscious mind and childhood experiences affect our behavior. And so this is the typical idea of what you would think psychology would look like, right? The person on the couch talking to the therapist about something that happened with the client's mother, right? So that talk therapy sort of has that branches in Freudian or foundations in Freudian psychology. And then we have Skinner, who focused on personality theory and also was a therapist. Then we move into the 1960s, where some of our branches and founding schools of thought take a shift. We start with humanistic psychology that found behaviorism and Freudian psychology too limiting, and they wanted to emphasize on the human potential for growth. So we have Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who were sort of the founding psychologists in this field. They focus on the need for love, acceptance, and an environment that nurtures and identifying, right, whether an environment nurtures or limits personal growth. Something that's very notable from this branch and from Maslow himself is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid that has these different levels that humans have to hit before they can reach self-actualization, which is like the peak personhood, right? And the base level being, right, safety, companionship, food, water. There's different arguments as whether sex is a basic need, but you have to have that base level filled before you can go to the next one. And then that one has to be filled before you can go to the next one. And then all of them have to be met and filled before you can reach self-actualization. We then go on to the cognitive revolution, which begins in the 60s and it's simultaneously happening with humanistic psychology. So we have psychology, which focus on behavior, mental processes, has roots in many different disciplines in many different countries, and it's growing and globalizing at this time. Then we have the branch of cognitive psychology, right? We're still studying those mental processes, such as those that occur when we're perceiving information, learning information, remembering, thinking, communicating, or solving problems. So the way I like to think of cognitive psychology is our mental processes and understanding sort of the way we work like a computer. So a lot of cognitive psychology can be sort of mirrored onto computer science, right? How a computer perceives information, right? Which is like the keyboard or the mouse or the hard drive. We perceive information with our eyes and our ears and our senses. The ways we learn information, right? We do learn information through some different cognitive processes, which we're going to talk about in our memory and learning chapters. Computers learn through their code. Memory, right? Remembering things, our memory processes can be sort of synonymized with RAM, random access memory, I think that's what that's called, in a computer, right? That is able to recall information. So that's cognitive psychology. And then we go into cognitive neuroscience, which is an interdisciplinary study, which means it kind of combines psychology with medicine mostly and biology. So it's a study of brain activity linked to cognition, with including perception, thinking, memory, and language. We also have evolutionary psychology. So, right, how the evolutionary process has influenced our behaviors and our mind and our thinking, right? And also how natural selection has influenced and how natural selection has sort of prompted what gets passed down and what doesn't. This is also where we have that nature versus nurture issue come up, which is the idea or the question, right? Is it the traits we're given at birth, or is it things that are developed through our experiences? And this is also where we're going to see a lot of twin studies, right? So you'll have a pair of twins who are genetically the same, who are raised in different environments. And we're trying to figure out, okay, they have the same genetic makeup. So if it's nature, they're going to exhibit the same traits. If it's nurture, it's going to be completely different because they are in different environments. And so it's where that issue comes up, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. This is also where we see a lot of Darwinism and natural selection studies sort of take place. And so the Darwin's Origin of Species is heavily influenced here. So it's inherited traits that are better enabled survival and reproduction are most likely to be passed down to the next generation. So it's evolutionary psychology is identifying what are those traits that ensure survival and are passed down. We then have behavioral genetics or behavior genetics, which is the study of relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. This is also where we're going to see epigenetics, which is how our genes interact with our environments. So there are certain gene markers that we have that can be either turned on or turned off, depending on the environment we are in, which is why it's not necessarily a question of nature versus nurture. It's nurture works on what nature endows. So it's not one or the other. It's how they interact with each other. We then go into cross-cultural and gender psychology. So remember how I said in the beginning of this lecture that a lot of founding research was done on a specific group of people, with a specific group of people conducting those studies. And those people were from a weird culture. Weird stands for Western educated, and educated meaning Western ideas of education, which is like college education. So Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's who we were pulling studies from and who was creating the studies. And I would also argue, right, that these were also studies done by men, which is an important factor because, or biological men, because certain things that are studied in biological men might not be able to transfer. So we have cross-cultural and gender psychology to help sort of bridge the gaps of things that were missing from our founding psychological studies. And the culture being defined as shared ideas and behaviors passed from one generation to the next, right? So the culture, the ideas, the behavior that we have in, say, Western culture or culture in the United States will not be the same in another culture, say cultures in Russia or in Asia, right? Or in many of the Asian countries. So being able to have studies that can be done in different cultures and with different genders, right? Whether that be a biological definition of gender or a social definition of gender is super important, so we can make sure that our studies and our results are generalizable to populations, to different populations. We'll then go into positive psychology, right? This centers on happiness, and happiness being a byproduct of pleasant, engaged, and meaningful lives. and how to achieve those pleasant, engaged and meaningful lives. So we're using the scientific method to support the development of a good life. Seligman, I'm not sure how to say that, Seligman and others focused research on human flourishing, right? How do we be the best people we can be? How do we be the happiest people we can be? That's positive psychology. So all these different branches of psychology can kind of go into one of these three levels of analysis, right? Biological, psychological, social, cultural, or social cultural. So cognitive neuroscience can go in pretty heavy and stay in the analysis field of biological. Freudian psychology can pretty heavily stay in the psychological level of analysis. Positive psychology can stay in the social cultural level of analysis. But when you solely look at one silo of analysis, you're really missing how the other two could be impacting whatever you're looking at, whether it's behavior, a mental process, a way information is perceived, right? It's important to look at it from a biopsychosocial approach, right? So including all three in how you are analyzing whatever it is you're looking at. So when we're looking at the biological inferences, right, we're looking at genetic predispositions, genetic mutations, natural selection of adaptive behaviors, and genes that are responding to the environment. Remember, I talked about epigenetics and how those gene markers can be turned on and off depending on what environment you're in. We also have the psychological influences, learned fear, like we saw with little Albert, emotional responses, cognitive processing, how we're taking in and remembering information. Then we have the social cultural influences, the presence of others, which we're going to be talking about some different studies later, but how important social pressure is on making decisions or performing certain behaviors. Cultural, societal, and family expectations, right? And how that's different in different cultures, right? In a Western, more individualized culture, the family expectations or the cultural expectations might not be as influential as it would be in a community-based culture, collective culture, where those family expectations and ties and those social and cultural ties are really strong. You also have peer and other group influences. So the influence of your friends, the influence of, say, your institution you belong to, like a college, impacts your behavior and your mental processes. And then models or role models that you see, whether those are people directly in your life or people that are in media. We also have some psychology subfields. So we have basic research, and those are just individuals who are trying to expand the base of knowledge in psychology. You then have applied research. So this is research being done to solve a particular practical problem that people are experiencing day to day. Then we have professional psychology. There's different levels to professional psychology. Our first being counseling psychologists. These are individuals who work in the community. They work with people who experience hardship in their day-to-day life, whether it's people experiencing trouble in schools, trouble at work, trouble in marriage or in relationships, people who are just trying to improve their overall well-being. They might also work with people who experience or have psychological disorders, but generally clinical psychologists are ones that are working with people who have a psychological disorder. We also have psychiatrists, and this is a branch of medicine. So to be a psychiatrist, you have to go to medical school. And these are individuals who are working with people who have psychological disorders. They're the only branch of psychology that can prescribe medication that within psychology, right? Your doctor can also prescribe medication, but if you are looking for and like antidepressants, you might generally go to a psychiatrist. They also can provide talk therapy, but not as common, right? Generally, you're going to see a team of a counselor and a psychiatrist, or a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist if you are experiencing a mental disorder and you are pursuing help. You also have community psychologists who are seeing how you interact with social situations and how social expectations and social organizations impact the person. So community psychologists really closely resemble our sister discipline, which is sociology. So how social influences impact the person and how the person impacts social issues or social influences. So what is the need for psychological science? Why do we need to approach it with the scientific method? And one of the reasons, or one of the couple reasons, is roadblocks to critical thinking. We as people will not always think so critically. And some of the reasons for that is we might experience hindsight bias, which is like the I knew it all along phenomenon. So the idea, right, hindsight's 2020. It's like, oh, I knew this would happen, when really you didn't. You just think you do because you've experienced it now. There's the overconfidence theory, right? The tendency that we think we know more than we generally do. And then the perceived patterns and random events. Random sequences are unsettling to us as humans. So we want to put things in order to make it make sense, right? Make it calm. So we will put things together and say it's a pattern when really these things have no connection to each other at all. So scientific inquiry, following the scientific method, really helps us sift through what is reality and what is the overestimated intuition and illusion that we are experiencing because of these critical thinking roadblocks. So psychological science in a post-truth world. We are very vulnerable to believing things that aren't true. And there's a couple different reasons for this. One of those reasons being fake news, right? People or media outlets who intentionally provide misinformation, right? So critical thinking is super important, right? And one of the parts of critical thinking is evaluating your source and making sure that isn't a source who is providing fake news or misinformation. Repetition is another reason why we're very vulnerable to untruths, is when a statement is repeated multiple times by multiple people, it becomes very believable, right? If enough people tell you, if you're looking at, say, a piece of paper and there's 3 lines on it, and one of the lines is significantly shorter, if multiple people are repeatedly telling you those lines are all the same size, you might eventually start to believe it. There's availability of powerful examples, right? Using vivid images and very compelling stories to gain attention. We're going to remember those examples. And so we're going to remember the information attached to them, whether it's true or not. And then group identity and echo chambers. We surround ourselves with people who have the same ideas and beliefs as us. We consume news and information that is provided by people who have the same views and beliefs as us. And if we are interacting with people who don't have the same views, or we're consuming information from a source that does not have the same views, we demonize those sources and people. So being able to step out of your echo chamber is going to be really important, and not only understanding your own beliefs, but understanding if something you're consuming is true or not, because it exists in your echo chamber and it's the only thing you're hearing. This is a really good example of what living in an echo chamber looks like. So this is a moral contagion in social networks. This is a study pulled off of Twitter, and it's a map showing how people are sharing messages and retweeting information. And it shows right here and right here that people are only reposting, sending, retweeting, or sending messages to people who already have the same beliefs as they do. Right. So if you look over here, if you have a liberal view, you are only, and this is the blue right here, you are only sharing information, right? Retweeting or interacting with people who have the same beliefs. Same thing over here. If you have a conservative view, you are only retweeting or sharing information with people who have the same beliefs. And this is when we're talking about sort of contentious topics like gun control, abortion. There's another one like gun control, abortion. I can't remember what the third one was, but they're just like really contentious topics. We are operating in silos when we're talking about these. And so that can make us vulnerable to believing things that aren't true. So we're actually going to pause the video right here. This would be a great time for you to take a break, look at your notes, go through the outline, and we are going to pick back up at the scientific method, and we're going to go through those slides.